The cold was a discipline. It was the first and last thing Jack felt each day in the small cabin tucked deep into the folds of the Colorado mountains. It settled in his bones, a familiar ache that mirrored the permanent winter in his soul. For 2 years since Sarah's death, and 3 since he'd lost Aries on a sun-scorched ridge halfway around the world, the cold had been his only constant companion. He did not fight it, he embraced it. The cold demanded order, a stripping away of the non-essential, and that suited the man he had become. A man hollowed out, leaving only the scaffolding of his training. Former Navy SEAL, Master Chief Petty Officer Jackson Croft, was now just Jack, a ghost haunting the tree line. His mornings were a ritual of hard-won stillness. Up before the sun clawed its way over the eastern peaks, coffee brewed with military precision, floorboards swept clean. Everything in the small space had its place, a grid of control imposed upon a life that had spiraled into chaos and left him the sole survivor. Sarah's favorite mug sat clean and inverted on the drying rack, unused. Ayres's worn leather collar lay coiled on the mantelpiece, a silent testament to a loyalty so pure it felt like a condemnation of his own survival. He would run his thumb over the brass nameplate, the metal frigid against his skin, and feel nothing but the dull throb of absence. His heart was a locked room, the key long lost. The world outside his self-imposed prison was a study in gray and white. The pines stood like stoic sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. The wind whispered through them, a sound like a long, drawn-out sigh. It was a landscape that matched his interior, barren, quiet, frozen. He had chosen this place for its unforgiving nature, for the way it demanded strength without offering comfort. It was a penance of sorts. He had been trained to protect, to be the shield, and he had failed the only two souls who mattered. So here he would remain, guarding nothing but the ghosts that filled the empty spaces in his cabin. The storm arrived without fanfare, a silent thickening of the afternoon sky. It began as a soft dusting of flakes, then escalated with quiet fury into a blinding curtain of white. Jack watched it from his window, a mug of coffee warming his hands. Blizzards were honest. They did not pretend to be anything other than what they were, a force of raw, indiscriminate power. He checked his firewood supply, his stores of canned goods. He was prepared. He was always prepared. It was the one part of his old life he had been allowed to keep. The mission was simple now. Survive the winter, survive the day, survive the next hour. It was near dusk, when the world had dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and snow, that he saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of his clearing, a dark shape struggling against the whiteout. It was a dog, a German shepherd, its noble form battered and broken by the storm. It staggered, fell, and rose again, driven by some primal will that Jack recognized with a painful lurch in his chest. The animal was hurt, its gait crippled, one leg dragging uselessly behind it. It collapsed again, a dark mound against the deepening snow, and did not get up. For a long moment, Jack did nothing. His first instinct, the old one, the one he had tried to bury, screamed at him to move, to act, to intervene. But the new Jack, the one forged in grief, held him fast. Do not engage. Do not get involved. Attachment was a liability, a breach in the perimeter he had so carefully constructed around his heart. The dog was not his mission. But then the wind peeled back the curtain of snow for a heartbeat, and he saw its head lift. He saw its eyes. They were not panicked or wild, but filled with a profound, weary intelligence. An exhaustion that went beyond the physical. In that gaze, he saw a reflection of his own desolate landscape. And the ice around his heart cracked. He swore, a harsh guttural sound that was swallowed by the wind. The decision once made was executed with the speed and efficiency of a military operation. He pulled on his heavy coat, boots, and gloves, grabbing a thick wool blanket from the foot of his bed, Sarah's blanket, and a coil of rope from his gear locker. He moved out into the storm, the cold, a physical blow, the wind tearing at him, trying to force him back into the sterile safety of his fortress. He leaned into it, his broad shoulders set, his jaw tight. He was a man moving with purpose for the first time in years. The dog was barely conscious when he reached it. It was a female, her fur matted with ice and frozen blood. A deep gash ran along her flank, ugly and raw. He expected a growl, a snap of teeth, the defensive posture of a wounded animal. He got none. She simply watched him with those same ancient eyes, as if she had been waiting, as if she knew. He knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, holding out a gloved hand. She managed a weak thump of her tail against the snow, a gesture of trust so absolute it felt like a hot brand against his frozen conscience. "All right, girl," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "Let's get you out of this." He wrapped her carefully in Sarah's blanket, the scent of lavender and cedar rising faintly from the wool, ghost of a memory that almost brought him to his knees. He fashioned a makeshift travois from the rope and a fallen branch, securing her gently. The journey back to the cabin was a brutal fight against the elements. The wind howled its disapproval, and the snow tried to swallow him whole. But with every step, with every pull of the rope, he felt a flicker of something he thought had died long ago. A sense of duty, a mission. He was no longer just surviving, he was rescuing. Inside the cabin, the warmth was a shock. He laid the shepherd on the hearthrug before the fire he had built up to a roaring blaze. The light danced across her matted coat, revealing the true extent of her injuries. She was emaciated, her ribs stark beneath her skin. He worked with a focused intensity, his hands trained for the cold mechanics of weaponry, rediscovering a forgotten gentleness. He cleaned the wound on her side, stitching it with the neat, practiced motions of a field medic. He warmed a broth of beef and rice, coaxing her to eat from his hand. She took the food slowly, her gaze never leaving his face. He had breached his own defenses, letting a living, breathing thing into his sanctuary of grief. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft sound of her breathing, a fragile rhythm that pushed back against the storm raging both outside and in. Over the next few days, a new routine began to form, supplanting the old, rigid one. The dog, whom he had started calling Sheba, an echo of a name from a book Sarah had loved, became the center of his small universe. He fed her, tended to her wound, and sat with her by the fire, the silence between them comfortable, companionable. She healed with the stoic resilience of her breed. Her limp lessened, and the light returned to her intelligent eyes. She followed him from room to room, her presence a quiet anchor in the drifting sea of his days. The sterile order of his home was disrupted by the faint, earthy smell of a dog, by a water bowl on the floor, by the soft thump of her tail against the leg of a chair. It was life, messy and unpredictable, seeping back into the cracks of his broken world. Then came the boot. On the fifth morning, he awoke to find a battered old work boot placed neatly beside his bed. It was caked in mud and snow, with a dark reddish-brown stain across the toe that looked unnervingly like old blood. He stared at it, confused. He had thrown out all his old work boots months ago. He tossed it back outside, assuming she had dragged it in from some neighbor's trash pile, though his nearest neighbor was miles away. The next morning, it was back, in the exact same spot. Every morning thereafter, the ritual was repeated. Sheba would greet him with a soft whine, her tail wagging, the muddy stained boot held gently in her mouth as an offering. He tried to understand it. Was it a gift? A game? The military analyst in him searched for a pattern, a meaning. The boot was old, the leather cracked, the sole worn thin. The stain was not blood, he determined upon closer inspection, but rust, or perhaps the iron-rich clay from the creek bed. But why this boot? Where was she getting it? His curiosity began to outweigh his desire for inaction. The boot was a question, and he found to his surprise that he wanted an answer. One morning, after she delivered her strange tribute, he did not throw it outside. He put on his coat and followed her. She trotted ahead, glancing back every so often to make sure he was still there, her tail held high. She led him away from the cabin, past the edge of the clearing, and deep into the dense woods he had avoided for 2 years. The snow was deep, but she moved with a new strength, a clear purpose. She was leading him somewhere. She was showing him something. She took him to a place where a giant spruce had fallen long ago, its massive root ball torn from the earth, creating a hollowed-out space beneath the trunk. It was a natural den, sheltered from the wind and snow. Sheba stopped at the entrance, looked back at him, and gave a soft bark of encouragement. Jack hesitated, a sudden, inexplicable tension coiling in his gut. He crouched down, peering into the darkness of the den, and then he heard it, a faint, high-pitched mewling. His breath caught in his chest. He pulled a small tactical flashlight from his pocket and shined its beam into the hollow. There, nestled in a bed of dry leaves and what looked like scraps of old fabric, were 3 puppies. They were tiny, their eyes barely open, squirming against each other for warmth. 2 were dark like their mother, and 1 was a lighter sable. They were the reason for her fight, the secret she had been protecting. The boot, he realized, was likely from the long-dead prospector or hunter who had once used this den as a shelter. It was her offering, her proof of providence, her way of telling him she could provide. She had brought it to the man who had saved her, a gesture of trust and partnership. A wave of emotion so powerful it staggered him, washed over Jack. He saw not just puppies, but a testament to a mother's fierce, unyielding love. He saw the reason she had fought her way through a blizzard mortally wounded to find help. It hadn't been for herself. It had been for them. He looked at Sheba, who sat watching him, her head cocked, her eyes soft and pleading. The last wall around his heart crumbled into dust. He wasn't just a rescuer, he was a guardian. This was his pack now, his responsibility. Getting them back to the cabin was a delicate operation. He used his own jacket to create a warm, soft sling for the puppies, carrying them against his chest. Sheba trotted at his heels, never more than a few feet away, her trust in him absolute. Back in the warmth of the cabin, he fashioned a whelping box from a wooden crate and old blankets, placing it by the fire. Sheba immediately jumped in, nudging her pups, licking them clean, and settling down to let them nurse. The cabin, once a silent monument to loss, was now filled with the soft, contented sounds of a new family. The chaos was immediate and overwhelming. Puppies, he quickly learned, were agents of entropy. They were tiny, wriggling bundles of need. As they grew, their personalities began to emerge. One of the dark ones was bold and fearless, constantly tripping over his own paws in his haste to explore. He'd charge at a dust bunny as if it were a mortal enemy, only to end up in a clumsy somersault. Jack started calling him Buddy. The name, a small private joke. He was a foolish hero, all heart and no brakes. The other dark pup was his opposite. He was quiet and cautious, always watching from the edge of the group, his dark eyes seeming to hold the same ancient gravity as his mother's. He would study Jack's face for long moments before cautiously approaching to sniff his hand. Jack named him Shadow, for he seemed to carry the weight of the world in his small frame, mirroring the very shadows Jack had lived in for so long. The third, the sable female, was a perfect blend of the two, playful but gentle. He called her Willow. His supplies meant for 1 man dwindled at an alarming rate. He was out of rice, low on meat, and puppy food was not something he kept in his Spartan pantry. He had to go to town. The thought filled him with a familiar dread. Town meant people. It meant questions. It meant breaking the isolation that had kept him safe. But looking at the 3 small lives and their vigilant mother, he knew he had no choice. His mission parameters had changed. The town of Havenwood was nestled in the valley, a small collection of buildings that looked like they had sprouted from the mountains themselves. The general store was run by Martha, a woman with silver hair, a spine of steel, and eyes that saw far too much. She had known his parents and had sent a casserole to the cabin after Sarah's funeral, a gesture he had acknowledged with a curt, impersonal note. He walked in, the bell above the door announcing his unwelcome arrival. Martha looked up from behind the counter, her expression unreadable. "Jackson," she said, her voice calm and steady. "The mountain hasn't swallowed you whole yet, I see." "Martha," he replied, his own voice clipped. He grabbed a large bag of dog food, then another of puppy chow, piling them on the counter along with rice, meat, and other essentials. Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Expecting company?" she asked, a gentle probing in her tone. Jack felt the old defenses rise. "Just stocking up." She looked at him, her gaze lingering on the weariness in his eyes, the subtle softening of his hard jawline. "Sarah always said you had a bigger heart than you let on," she said quietly, ringing up his items. "Hard to get into, but safe and warm once you were inside." The mention of his wife's name was like a physical blow, but for the first time, the pain was mingled with a strange, bittersweet warmth. He simply nodded, unable to speak, paid for his supplies, and left. He felt Martha's knowing eyes on his back the entire way out. His next stop was the town's veterinary clinic. He knew the dogs needed a proper checkup. The vet, Dr. Emily Carter, was younger than he expected, with kind, intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put him on edge. He was used to authority, to clear chains of command. Her gentle competence was a foreign language. He explained the situation in curt mission report sentences. Rescued dog, blizzard, wounded, discovered pups. Emily listened patiently, her expression a mixture of sympathy and professional focus. "Can you bring them in?" she asked. "Negative," he said, the military jargon slipping out. "The mother is still protective. The pups are too young. It's better if you make a house call." It was a demand, not a request, but he hadn't meant it to be. She smiled, a small, understanding smile that disarmed him completely. "All right, Sergeant," she said, her tone light. "I can be there this afternoon. Just give me the address to this top-secret facility of yours." When Emily arrived at the cabin, she moved with a quiet confidence that put both him and the dogs at ease. Sheba, who had been growling low in her chest since the truck pulled up, seemed to sense the woman's peaceful intent and allowed her to approach the whelping box, sniffing her hand before settling back down. Emily examined the mother's wound, praising his handiwork. "You could have been a surgeon," she remarked. "Just a medic," he grunted. She then turned her attention to the puppies, her touch gentle and sure. Buddy tried to launch a clumsy assault on her stethoscope, tumbling over himself in a flurry of paws and earning a soft laugh from her. Willow licked her hand with quiet affection, but Shadow shrank back, pressing himself into his mother's side, a low tremble running through his small body. Emily didn't force it. She simply watched him, her eyes soft with understanding. "This one's a worrier," she said, looking at Jack. "Some of them are just born with an old soul. They feel everything a little more deeply." Jack looked at the small, trembling pup and felt an acute, painful sense of recognition. He saw himself, the watchful soul, always on guard, always anticipating the next blow. Emily finished her examination, giving the dogs a clean bill of health and a course of dewormer. As she packed her bag to leave, she paused at the door. "You saved them, Jack," she said, her voice sincere. "All of them. That's an amazing thing." He just shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. They were in the way of the storm. "I just moved them." Emily shook her head, her kind eyes seeing right through his armor. "No," she said softly. "You did more than that. You gave them a safe harbor." She left him standing in the doorway, the quiet warmth of the cabin at his back, feeling more exposed and seen than he had in years. The castle walls were beginning to feel less like a fortress and more like a prison. The peace, however, was short-lived. A week later, county sheriff's vehicle crunched up his long, unplowed driveway. Sheriff Brody was a big man, fair and respected in Havenwood, but he was also a man who followed the letter of the law. He'd gotten a call from a hunter who had seen signs of a stray denning on state land and had heard about Jack taking in a dog. "Jack!" Brody said, his expression apologetic as he stood on the porch, refusing to come inside. "I'm glad you helped her out. You did a good thing. But the law is the law. Unclaimed strays, especially with a litter, have to be brought into the county shelter." Jack's blood ran cold. The shelter. Cages. Concrete floors. The possibility of separation. The word was a death sentence. "They're not strays," Jack said, his voice dangerously low. "They're mine." "You can't just claim them," Brody explained patiently. "There's a process. They have to be held for a 10-day observation period, checked for diseases, and then they can be put up for adoption. You'd be first on the list, of course, but they have to come in." The thought of Shadow, his fearful, watchful soul, cowering in a cage, was unbearable. The thought of Buddy's foolish, brave heart being broken, of Sheba being separated from the pups she had fought so hard for, it was a strategic impossibility. A mission failure he would not accept. "No," Jack said, the single word as hard and unyielding as granite. Brody sighed, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Jack, don't make this difficult. I'm giving you 2 days to bring them in yourself. After that, I'll have to come with an animal control officer and a warrant. It's my job." He looked genuinely sorry. 2 days, Jack. "That's the best I can do." The sheriff's truck disappeared down the driveway, leaving Jack in a silence that felt heavier and more threatening than the storm had. He had a deadline, an ultimatum. An external force, threatening his pack, his new mission. For years he had fought to feel nothing. Now, he was consumed by a cold, protective rage. He went back inside and looked at the sleeping dogs, a mother and her pups, utterly unaware of the bureaucratic threat that hung over them. He put his hand on Sheba's head, and she leaned into his touch. He was their guardian, and he would not fail this time. The next 2 days were a tense siege. Jack reinforced the gate at the end of his driveway, a futile but necessary act of defiance. He spent the time with the dogs, a silent, looming presence. He watched Buddy's clumsy play, Willow's gentle explorations, and his gaze always returned to Shadow, who seemed to sense the tension in the air. The small dog rarely left his side, often resting a tiny head on Jack's boot, his dark eyes fixed on the door as if expecting the enemy to arrive at any moment. The bond between the wounded man and the fearful pup had solidified into something unspoken and profound. They were kindred spirits, veterans of unseen wars. On the second day, the sky turned a familiar, ominous gray. Another storm was rolling in, this one predicted to be even more ferocious than the last. The wind began to pick up, rattling the window panes, a mournful drumbeat counting down the minutes to Brody's deadline. Jack was securing a loose shutter on the side of the cabin. When it happened, a sudden, violent gust of wind ripped the back door, which hadn't latched properly, from its frame, and slammed it against the outer wall with a deafening crack. The sound, sharp and explosive like a gunshot, sent a shockwave of panic through the cabin. Sheba barked a frantic, high-pitched sound. Buddy and Willow scrambled under the kitchen table, but Shadow, propelled by a primal, overwhelming terror, shot out of the open doorway and into the maelstrom. "Shadow!" Jack roared, his voice ripped away by the wind. He saw the small dark shape for only a second before it was swallowed by the swirling snow. There was no thought, no hesitation. The mission was clear. One of his own was outside the wire in enemy territory. He grabbed his heavy-duty parka, a powerful flashlight, and a length of climbing rope, his body moving with the fluid economy of years of training. He didn't bother with the door, vaulting over the porch railing, and landing in the deep snow, already tracking the small, frantic paw prints that were disappearing as fast as they were made. The storm was a living entity, a white monster of wind and ice. It clawed at him, its freezing breath stealing the air from his lungs. The visibility was near zero. He moved by instinct, following the slight depressions in the snow, his mind a cold calculating machine, assessing terrain, wind direction, and the likely path of a terrified animal. His old leg injury, a souvenir from an IED, began to scream in protest, a hot, sharp pain that radiated from his thigh. He ignored it. Pain was just data. It could be compartmentalized. Failure could not. He followed the tracks down toward the frozen creek that bordered his property. The wind was shrieking now, a maddening symphony of chaos. He shouted Shadow's name until his throat was raw, the sound barely carrying a few feet before being torn to shreds. Despair, cold and sharp as an icicle, began to pierce his armor of discipline. He was too slow. The storm was too strong. He had failed again. Then he heard it, a thin, terrified yelp, nearly lost in the howl of the wind. It came from the direction of the creek. He pushed forward, half running, half falling through the deep drifts. The creek was a treacherous landscape of ice and snow-covered rocks, and in the middle of it, he saw him. Shadow had fallen through a weak spot in the ice and was struggling in the black churning water, his tiny paws scrabbling uselessly at the slick breaking edges of the ice. He was going under. Jack didn't break stride. He hit the edge of the creek, shrugging off his heavy parka as he moved. The ice groaned under his weight. He lay flat, distributing his mass, trying to reach the pup, but the ice gave way, plunging him into the freezing water. But the shock was a physical blow, a massive fist that drove the air from his body and threatened to stop his heart. The cold was no longer a discipline, it was an assassin. It leached the strength from his limbs, the heat from his core. But his eyes were locked on the puppy, who was now limp, barely clinging to consciousness. He lunged through the chest-deep water, the current pulling at him, chunks of ice scraping his skin raw. He reached Shadow, grabbing the scruff of his neck with a numb hand. He turned, fighting his way back to the bank, his body screaming in protest. He hauled himself and the puppy out of the water, collapsing onto the frozen ground, his movements clumsy and slow. Shadow was not breathing. "No," Jack gasped, his own breath coming in ragged, painful clouds. "You don't quit on me. You do not quit." He turned the puppy over, clearing his airway, and began to perform CPR, blowing small, warm puffs of air into the tiny lungs, compressing the small chest with 2 fingers. The movements were automatic, drilled into him long ago. 1 breath, 5 compressions. Again, and again. He worked with a frantic, desperate focus, oblivious to the storm, to his own shivering, to the creeping numbness that signaled the onset of severe hypothermia. He was losing his own battle, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was the small, still life in his hands. "Come on, Shadow," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "Breathe. Just breathe." A bright light cut through the blinding snow, sweeping across the scene. A vehicle door slammed. A figure was running toward him. It was Sheriff Brody. He had come to enforce the law. Instead, he found a scene of desperate life-giving love. "Jack!" Brody yelled, his face a mask of shock as he took in the scene. Jack, soaked and half-frozen, working feverishly on the tiny, lifeless body of a puppy. Just as Brody reached him, Shadow coughed, a small, weak spasm, and vomited a gush of icy water. He took a shuddering breath, then another. Jack immediately ripped open his own wet shirt, tucking the shivering puppy against his bare skin, trying to transfer what little body heat he had left. He wrapped them both in the parka he'd discarded. Brody stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping around them, the reality of what he had just witnessed sinking in. He saw a man who had gone into a frozen hell for the smallest, most vulnerable member of his pack. He saw a man willing to trade his life for a dog. He saw not a lawbreaker, but a protector. He knelt, taking off his own thick coat and wrapping it around Jack's shaking shoulders. "Let's get you home," the sheriff said, his voice thick with an emotion Jack couldn't quite place. It sounded like respect. Back in the cabin, a whirlwind of controlled chaos ensued. Brody, using his radio, had summoned Emily Carter, who arrived looking like a warrior ready for battle, her medical bag in hand. She and Brody worked together, getting Jack out of his wet clothes and into warm blankets while she simultaneously worked on Shadow, wrapping him in heated towels and giving him a shot of warmed fluids. Sheba and the other two pups whined anxiously from their box, sensing the crisis. Sheriff Brody watched the scene, his face grim. He looked at Jack, who was now wrapped in a half-dozen blankets by the fire, shivering uncontrollably, but refusing to take his eyes off Shadow. The sheriff walked over to his truck, came back inside, and tore a page from his official notebook. He crumpled it into a ball and tossed it into the fire. "Lost the paperwork on the way up here," he said, his voice gruff. "Terrible storm. I guess I'll have to swing by next week to help you get the registration forms filled out for your dogs." Jack looked up at him, and for the first time, the two men truly saw each other. Jack managed a single grateful nod. The siege was over. His family was safe. In the weeks that followed, the cabin transformed. The last of the winter snows melted, revealing the first green shoots of spring. The fortress of solitude became a center of warmth and life. Emily became a regular visitor, first to check on the dogs, and then simply to check on Jack. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the puppies tumble in the grass, their conversation easy and unforced. Martha would drop by with a pie or a stew, her knowing smile saying everything that didn't need to be said. Sheriff Brody even stopped by, once with a bag of chew toys, ruffling Buddy's ears and giving Shadow a gentle pat. Jack had found a new mission, not one of violence and survival, but one of care and connection. His days were filled with the happy chaos of his pack. Buddy, the foolish hero, once tried to rescue a garden gnome from a particularly aggressive squirrel, ending with the gnome's hat in his mouth and a look of profound confusion on his face. Willow grew into a graceful and intelligent dog, a perfect echo of her mother, and Shadow, the watchful soul, found his courage. He was still quiet, still observant, but the fear in his eyes was replaced by a deep, abiding loyalty. He was never far from Jack's side, a constant, grounding presence. One evening, as the setting sun painted the peaks in hues of orange and purple, Jack sat on his porch steps, Emily beside him. Sheba rested at his feet, and Shadow laid his head on Jack's knee, his eyes closing in contentment. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, worn harmonica. It had been Sarah's favorite. He hadn't touched it since she died. He brought it to his lips and played a simple, clear melody, the notes drifting out into the clean mountain air. It was a sad song, but it was not a song of despair. It was a song of remembrance, of love that endured, of a grief that now coexisted with a quiet, profound joy. The music was a bridge between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. The rescuer had been rescued. His heart was no longer a locked room, but a safe harbor, its doors finally open to the warmth of the sun. He had a family. He was home.